I've always scoffed at ghost stories. They seemed like nothing more than fanciful tales spun to entertain or frighten the gullible. I prided myself on being a rational person, someone who relied on logic and evidence. Haunted houses? Please, give me a break. The idea that spirits of the dead could linger and interact with the living was, to me, utterly preposterous. I had always dismissed such notions with a wave of my hand and a roll of my eyes. So, when I moved into this old Edwardian house built in 1912, I did so with a healthy dose of skepticism. The house was a relic of a bygone era, with its grand architecture and intricate woodwork. It was the kind of place that might inspire ghost stories, but I was having none of it. The place had character, sure, with its creaky floorboards and antique fixtures. The craftsmanship was undeniable, and I appreciated the history that seemed to seep from every corner. But haunted? Not a chance, I thought. It was just an old house, nothing more. But haunted? Not a chance, I thought. I walked through the rooms with confidence, dismissing any eerie feelings as mere figments of my imagination. After all, I was a man of reason, not superstition. The first few weeks were uneventful. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but I found solace in that stillness. It was a welcome change from the constant noise and chaos of the city. I settled into a routine, enjoying the solitude and the old-world charm of the place. I spent my evenings reading by the fireplace, the crackling of the logs the only sound breaking the silence. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. The house had a certain stillness, a quietness that I found comforting. It was as if time had slowed down within its walls, allowing me to escape the frenetic pace of modern life. I felt at ease, as if I had found a sanctuary. It was a far cry from the bustling city life I had left behind, the constant hum of traffic, the blaring of horns, the never-ending rush of people. It all seemed like a distant memory. Here in this old house I could breathe, think, and simply be. One evening I noticed the bathroom light was on. It was a small thing, but it caught my attention. I distinctly remembered switching it off before heading to bed. I stood there puzzled, trying to recall if I had perhaps forgotten, but no, I was certain. I had turned it off. Odd, I thought, but probably just a wiring quirk in this old house. These things happen, right? Old houses have their quirks, and I was prepared to accept that. Maybe the wiring was faulty, or perhaps there was a loose connection somewhere. I flipped the switch a couple of times just to be sure. The light flickered, then went out. Satisfied, I shrugged it off and went about my evening. The light flickered off and I dismissed it as nothing more than an old house being an old house. It was an easy explanation, one that fit neatly into my rational worldview. I wasn't about to let a few flickering lights turn me into some ghost-hunting fanatic. I had read enough stories and seen enough movies to know how these things went, but I was determined not to let my imagination run wild. I had better things to do with my time, or so I thought. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The house had more in store for me, and my skepticism would soon be put to the test in ways I could never have imagined. A few nights later, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door. I got out of bed and cautiously made my way through the dark house. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder as I approached the source. My heart pounded in my chest, but I told myself it was just the house settling. When I reached the room where the noise seemed to be coming from, I found nothing unusual. The room was empty and the tapping had stopped. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled over me. I returned to bed, but sleep eluded me. My mind raced with thoughts of what could have caused the noise. I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, but doubt had begun to creep in. Over the next few days, more strange occurrences began to happen. Lights flickered on and off, objects seemed to move on their own, and I heard whispers in the dead of night. Each time I tried to find a rational explanation, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. In my quest for answers, I decided to look into the history of the house. I found old records and documents that detailed the lives of its previous owners. Some had lived long, happy lives, while others had met tragic ends. One story in particular caught my attention. It was about a family who had lived in the house during the 1920s. They had experienced a series of mysterious deaths, and rumors of hauntings had plagued the house ever since. Armed with this new information, I began to look at the house with new eyes. The creaks and groans of the old structure no longer seemed benign. The shadows in the corners seemed to move and the stillness felt oppressive. I decided to investigate further. If there was something more to this house, I wanted to know. I was no longer content to dismiss the strange occurrences as mere coincidences. I needed answers. I set up cameras and recording equipment throughout the house, determined to capture any evidence of the paranormal. If there were spirits here, I would find them. My skepticism had given way to a burning curiosity. As I reviewed the footage, I found things I couldn't explain. Shadows moving on their own, strange lights, and even faint voices. It was undeniable. Something was happening in this house, something beyond my understanding. My journey from skeptic to believer had been a tumultuous one. I had come to this house with a firm belief in the rationale, only to have that belief shattered by the unexplainable. The Edwardian house had changed me, opened my mind to possibilities I had never considered. As I stood in front of the house, I felt a mix of apprehension and intrigue. The skeptic in me was still there, but it had been tempered by a newfound respect for the unknown. The house had its secrets, and I was determined to uncover them, no matter where the journey might lead. As the days turned into weeks, the minor oddities continued. Doors creaked open on their own. Footsteps echoed in the hallway when I was home alone. I chalked it up to drafts, settling floorboards, the usual suspects in an old house. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I found myself listening intently for any unusual sounds, my senses on high alert. The silence of the house, once comforting, now seemed to hum with an unseen energy. Still, I clung to my skepticism. I refused to entertain the possibility of the paranormal. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. I just had to find it. One evening, I was reading in the living room. The room was filled with the soft, warm glow of a single lamp, casting a cozy ambiance that made the vintage furniture and old bookshelves seem even more inviting. I had just settled into my favorite armchair, a cup of tea steaming beside me, and a thrilling mystery novel in my hands, when the lights began to flicker. At first it was just a slight dimming, barely noticeable, but then it grew more pronounced. The light bulb seemed to struggle, as if it were fighting against an unseen force. It wasn't the usual dimming I had experienced before. This was different, more intense, almost as if the light had a life of its own. The shadows in the room began to shift and change, creating an unsettling atmosphere. This time, the light seemed to dance and sway, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The shadows moved in a way that made them seem almost alive, twisting and turning in a macabre dance that sent chills down my spine. A shiver ran down my spine. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and a cold sweat began to form on my forehead. The room, which had felt so warm and inviting just moments before, now seemed cold and unwelcoming. All right, I muttered to myself, trying to sound nonchalant. I took a deep breath, attempting to calm my racing heart. It's just a faulty light bulb, I told myself, though I wasn't entirely convinced. If there's someone here, give me a sign. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. It was a foolish thing to say, but in that moment, I felt compelled to challenge whatever was causing the disturbance. I know. What was I thinking? The moment the words were out, I regretted them. I felt a pang of fear, wondering if I had just invited something sinister into my home. It was a stupid thing to say, even for a skeptic trying to sound brave. I'd always prided myself on being rational and logical, but in that moment I felt anything but. The light flickered violently for a moment, then stabilized. The sudden burst of light was almost blinding, and I had to shield my eyes. When I looked again, the light was steady, but the room felt different, as if it were holding its breath. I chuckled nervously, attributing it to faulty wiring once again. Just an old house, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. But the nervous laughter did little to ease the tension in the room. But inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just tempted fate. There was a nagging sensation in the back of my mind, a feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I tried to focus on my book, but the words swam before my eyes. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to the flickering light and the eerie shadows. The silence of the house seemed to press in on me, amplifying every creak and groan. Each sound seemed louder than the last, echoing through the empty rooms and making me jump at every little noise. The once comforting silence now felt oppressive, as if the house itself were alive and aware of my presence. I decided to get up and check the rest of the house. Maybe moving around would help calm my nerves. I walked cautiously through the dimly lit rooms, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. I checked the light switches and inspected the light fixtures, looking for any obvious signs of a problem. Everything seemed to be in order, but the uneasy feeling persisted. I glanced out the window into the dark night. The street outside was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I returned to the living room and sat back down in my armchair. The book lay open on my lap, but I couldn't bring myself to read it. My mind was too preoccupied with the strange events of the evening. I stared at the light bulb, half expecting it to start flickering again. But it remained steady, casting a warm glow over the room. Despite the calm appearance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I took a deep breath and tried to relax. "It's just my imagination," I told myself. "There's nothing to be afraid of." But deep down, I knew that something had changed. The house felt different, and I couldn't ignore the sense of unease that had settled over me. Deciding that it was best to call it a night, I got up and headed towards the bedroom. Maybe a good night's sleep would help clear my mind and put my fears to rest. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but replay the events of the evening in my mind. The flickering light, the eerie shadows, the oppressive silence, it all seemed like a bad dream. But I knew it was real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I closed my eyes, hoping that sleep would bring some relief. But even as I drifted off, I couldn't escape the feeling that the flickering light was just the beginning of something much larger, something that I wasn't prepared to face. That night, I lay in bed, trying to ignore the unsettling events of the evening. The day had been filled with strange occurrences, doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering without reason, and an eerie feeling that someone or something was watching me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the unease lingered. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, a loud bang echoed through the house. It was so sudden and jarring that it felt like the entire house shook. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a burglar, a ghost, or something even more sinister? It sounded like someone had slammed a sledgehammer against my bedroom wall. The noise was deafening, reverberating through the walls and into my very bones. I could almost feel the vibrations, as if the wall itself was crying out in pain. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The adrenaline surged through my veins, making my hands tremble and my breath come in short, rapid gasps. I felt like a cornered animal, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to do something. Fear, raw and primal, coursed through me. It was the kind of fear that strips away all rational thought, leaving only the most basic survival instincts. My mind was a whirlwind of terror, each thought more horrifying than the last. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, bathing the room in a warm glow. The light was a small comfort, pushing back the shadows that seemed to creep ever closer. But it did little to calm my racing heart or quiet my frantic thoughts. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the noise. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every creak of the house a potential danger. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, any clue as to what had caused the bang. The bang had come from the wall that connected to the attic. The attic, a place I rarely ventured, filled with old, forgotten things and the weight of years gone by. It was a place that always felt a little too quiet, a little too still. Could it be an animal? The thought crossed my mind, bringing with it a small measure of relief. An animal would be a logical explanation, something tangible and real, not the figments of my overactive imagination. A squirrel or a bird that had found its way in. It was possible, even likely, given the age of the house and the many nooks and crannies where a small creature could hide. But the noise had been so loud, so forceful. Could a small animal really have caused it? The thought, though unsettling, was preferable to the alternative. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. A malevolent presence, something that defied explanation and reason. I clung to the hope that it was just an animal, that the noise was nothing more than a momentary scare in the dead of night. But deep down, the fear remained, a shadow that refused to be banished by the light. Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate. I couldn't just lie there, paralyzed by fear. I had to know what had caused the noise. Slowly, I got out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor. Each step felt like an eternity as I made my way towards the attic door. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, shadowy interior of the attic. I hesitated, my heart pounding louder than ever. What if something was waiting for me in the darkness? I shone my flashlight into the attic, the beam cutting through the darkness. Old boxes and cobwebs filled the space, but there was no sign of any intruder. I took a cautious step inside, my senses on high alert. As I examined the attic, I found nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual clutter and dust that had accumulated over the years. The relief was overwhelming, washing over me like a wave. Maybe it really had been just an animal after all. I closed the attic door and made my way back to bed. The fear had not completely vanished, but it had lessened, replaced by a cautious optimism. I turned off the bedside lamp and lay back down, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. As I lay there, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The bang, the fear, the investigation. It all seemed like a bad dream, but I knew that the fear would return, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unexplained noise. For now, though, I allowed myself to relax, to breathe, and to hope that the rest of the night would be uneventful.